Hey everybody, it's about time to start, but I'm going to give it a few minutes for people to join. So I'm going to pull up this stream on my phone so I can actually see what you're seeing, and we'll get started in a minute. I'm going to wait till at least our facilitators have showed up. So Shirley, Carol Ann, let me know when y'all get here. And in the meantime, how is everybody doing today? Hello, Irvin. Oh, hey, Shirley, you are here. Fabulous. Yeah, I think we'll give it a few more minutes for people to turn up. Sometimes it's difficult to find the link for this live stream, so I'll just be here with my tea till people come. Actually, I'll show off my mug. This is from the Halicet Esquel conference in 2019 that was put on by the First Peoples Cultural Council. This was a super awesome conference. Concha Heather, hey ha. The crew is assembling. How's everybody doing on this Friday? Ready for a weekend? Even if weekends maybe don't mean very much while we're all stuck at home, but it's a weekend. Oh, it's cold in Honolulu, Shirley? What does that mean? Like 60 degrees? Yeah, freezing. If it's below 70, it's winter in Honolulu. Heather, at the moment, when I'm seeing your question, it looks like there are 15 people here. Hello, Maurice. Hello, Gerardo. How are you? Thank you for joining. Hi, Jennifer. All right, I'm going to give it 2 more minutes and then we can get started. Hey, Barcine. Oh, yeah, lockdown weekends. So exciting, right? Spend all week in your house and then spend the weekend in your house. Fun times. Yeah, Ivana, 60 degrees. That is downright freezing for Hawaii most of the time. I had a Zoom call with some folks at the University of Hawaii this week, and everyone was wearing like coats and hats and sweaters because it was 60 degrees. Hello, Kathleen. Hi, AJ. All right, 1 more minute and then we will get started. Yeah, Heather, I think anybody who will be involved in communications around Indigenous language issues, they will be really well served to read some of these papers from this week. There's a lot of great writing out there about sort of the ways we talk about language endangerment and revitalization. Hello, Gabriel. Yeah, heck yes, Bolivia, a very linguistically diverse country. All right, it looks like folks are finding their way here. We got people showing up, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So today, I'm very excited to welcome you to the first session of our first ever Advanced Language Documentation webinar. This is something we have been talking about here at the Endangered Languages Project and the Language Documentation Training Center for, well, the last 2 years that we've been running these webinars. We've always kind of wanted to take the learning a little further after the initial webinars And this is the first semester that we are actually able to offer the advanced webinar for folks who already finished the introductory one. So really excited to be here, very happy to have you all with us, and honored to be kicking it off with our first talk of the semester. So this is essentially the same setup as the previous webinars. So every week we'll have a live talk and a different person will present on a different topic every week. It's nice to get some variety of the faces you see. And even if you can't make it to the live sessions, we will record these talks and put them up on YouTube and in the Facebook group, so you can always catch up later. And again, if you did not join us for the introductory webinar, that's okay. You are still welcome to be here, but we're going to be building on things that we learned in the first webinar, so it might help if you go back and watch those videos and read those slides. And again, there's a little bit of a delay in the live feed, so maybe up to 2 minutes. So if you type a question and I don't answer it right away, or if there's a technical problem and I don't notice it, I'm keeping track on my phone. But there is a delay, so I'm not ignoring you. There's just a little bit of a time lag. If you have any technical problems, Shirley and Carol-Ann in the chat here should be able to help you. And I'm gonna try to be brief with today's talk because I want to be sure we have a lot of time for discussion. But there's a lot to cover on this topic, so it may run a little long this week. That's fine. I'm happy to hang out and answer questions for as long as you have questions or want to discuss. So we'll try not to go all night here. So today, what exactly are we going to be talking about? These are some sort of academic terms in the title of the talk. What are ideologies and discourses? I'm not trying to drown everyone in postmodernist literature or jargon here. This is actually a pretty simple concept. We're just going to be talking about the ways we talk about endangered languages and language documentation. And we're going to be talking a little bit about sort of the beliefs and ideas that shape how we talk about these issues, how we think about them, and how we approach doing the work of language documentation. And so obviously everybody has their own beliefs about language, right? What it is, why it's important. And I love that everyone has different ideas about this. It makes language work interesting. So today's session isn't going to cover all possible ideologies and rhetorics around this work. I'm just going to talk about some of the things that are most common to see in academia, in sort of the mainstream Western media, in the general world of language documentation. So this is just common themes that emerge in this world, but you've probably encountered some other themes, and I would love to hear about them at the end. So to get started, I'm going to introduce a concept called positionality. And this is a discursive frame or an idea about how to talk about this work that's becoming more and more common in the language documentation and revitalization world, as well as sort of the social sciences more generally. So positionality is a big word that just kind of means your position in relation to whatever you're studying or talking about or working on, right? So where you're coming from, what you believe about the topic, in this case language, your relationships to the language and the people who use it. So this is kind of like an autobiography of sorts, but a really specific autobiography that is how you relate to the work you're doing. And so a positionality statement, pretty self-explanatory. It's a statement of your positionality. It's kind of an explanation of who you are, where you're coming from, and how you're approaching your work. And the point of it is to help other people better understand and put your work in context. It adds an extra layer of transparency and explanation, and it's sort of a way to document the person doing the documentation. So let's take a quick example. Let's say Miriam is working to document wedding songs, marriage songs in Bainout Gubaher in Senegal. So think about the person doing this documentation. How do you think it might affect her work if she speaks the language or doesn't speak the language? Or maybe if she is a member of the language community versus maybe she's from a different area of Senegal versus she is totally a foreigner, she's from Germany or something. Um, how do you think it affects her work if she is a woman working on wedding songs or if she is married versus unmarried? Also, how do you think it might affect her work and the ways she interacts with people who speak the language if she is a professor or a student or a farmer or a school teacher or maybe some combination of these things? And also, if she's a young person versus an older person. This is also pretty important in contexts where age matters a lot to your social position. And there are all kinds of other aspects of Miriam's identity or background or training that will probably affect how her work goes and how her language documentation turns out. And these are all really important things to think about and, if possible, if it's comfortable, to share in the context of your work. So, to do this, to better put her work in context, Miriam might write a positionality statement. And so this will help make the documentation she's doing more accessible to other people. It will help it make sense, right? So maybe there are some wedding songs that are only sung by men in the company of other men. And you might not see that in Miriam's documentation because she's a woman, right? Or maybe there are some songs that are only heard by the woman getting married and other married women. This is just a hypothetical. And so if Miriam is unmarried, she might not be able to hear or document those songs. So who you are really does affect the work you do and the work you're able to do. So, as an example, I'm going to give you a positionality statement from me to help you understand the work I'm doing in giving this presentation. So, hello, I'm Anna Belew. Here are some perhaps relevant facts to how I approach these issues of language endangerment and documentation. So, I am a white lady from the United States. I grew up here. I live here. My mother tongue and my heritage language and my first language and basically all of it is English. I am raised speaking English, and as far as I know, most of my ancestors were English. I am okay at French, but I'm not very good at other languages. I am 34 years old. I have a PhD in linguistics. I work for the Endangered Languages Project. Most of my linguistic work since 2009 has been with Cameroonian languages and African languages in general. And I come from a university department that focuses very extensively on language documentation and what they call conservation, which sort of is a cover term for language revitalization and maintenance. And I also focus a lot on sociolinguistics, which is the study broadly of the relationships between people and languages and social structures. And my beliefs and my ideologies about language and language work have been shaped by my academic background, which includes, about 13 years of training in language documentation and sociolinguistics, as well as sort of my upbringing and my family context and my personal lived experience. So if you want to practice this, just as an exercise, you can draft a positionality statement of your own. It can be a few sentences, or it can be very long. Like in my dissertation, I had roughly a positionality statement that was like 15 pages long to explain my relationship to the language I was working on and the work I was doing. And I have given you a citation here for a paper that sort of gives an overview of positionality and positionality statements when you're doing this kind of social research or language work. I'm going to take 1 second and check the comments, see if there's anything else I need to address. Mostly I'm going to answer questions at the end, but one question, positionality is related to an executive summary. Kind of, I think. So an executive summary is like an abstract that gives an overview of what you're going to talk about in a paper or a piece of writing. So positionality statements might be part of that. Generally not, right? If you're writing a paper about wedding songs, Your abstract or executive summary might be something like, this paper explores wedding songs in Beinum Gubeher and explores the transmission of these songs, whatever. And then you might include a positionality statement in sort of the background information part of that writing. So this work was undertaken in 2018, and it was undertaken by me, and here is a little bit about me. We can go further into that at the end if you want. Yeah. Oh, Shirley did answer that. Um, yeah. So, can somebody please ban the Bitcoin person from the chat? Because that's not relevant at all. Thank you. All right. So, we are going to talk a bit about discourses of language endangerment in general. And this is a very interesting topic because the concept of endangered languages has become more widely known to the public by a lot just in the last 10 or 20 years, as well as within academia and within grassroots community practice, concepts of language endangerment, language documentation, and language revitalization have become much more common. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I've seen these issues presented and discussed in my own context, which is mostly academia and the sort of the popular media. I guarantee that you have had different experiences with these discourses and these ideologies. So I want to hear from you about how you see these things as well at the end. So I want to start with the word endangered itself and what implications that metaphor has, right? Because when we talk about things which are endangered, that's a term that came into the language world sort of from the biological conservation sphere, right? From what you might call environmental conservation or whatever. And it generally described living things, plants and animals, and sometimes what you might call ecosystems, even though there are problems with that word as well. And so this biological metaphor of language frames languages kind of like they're pandas or a species of flower or a kind of frog, right? It frames a language as a thing that's alive, a thing that can reproduce and live on that way, and a thing that can die. And you see this actually in a lot of parts of linguistics beyond just sort of documentation and revitalization endangerment studies. You see it in language classification or historical linguistics, right? When you talk about a language being descended from another language, or how Old English has Middle English as a daughter language. When you talk about how languages are related to each other, sometimes you'll talk about genetic similarity, even though languages aren't biological living things, they don't have genes, but it's a metaphor that we use a lot in the language world. And importantly for us, this metaphor implies that because languages are alive, because they have vitality, which is also a word that's part of this biological metaphor, they can die, right? Metaphorically, a language can die. And you see this all the time in headlines and book titles and paper titles and whatever else. So here we have newspaper headlines from 3 different countries that all use the phrase dying languages. And then we have a book called Dying Words about endangered languages. And I'm not picking on this book or any of these publications, right? It's just a fact that this death metaphor is widespread in the discourses around language. And when we talk about things that are endangered, especially sort of in the biology sphere, it usually comes with calls to action to save the endangered thing, right? So WWF will tell you pandas are endangered, save the pandas. But when we talk about saving a thing that's endangered, you'll notice that the term endangered is essentially a passive construction, right? A language is endangered. It doesn't say something is endangering the language. So it's a very different sentence if you say this language is endangered versus the government is actively suppressing this language. This agency question, when we talk about endangerment, is an important one to think about because And even when it's not a direct result of some type of settlement colonialism or other large scale suppression, it really removes the cause from our discussion about language endangerment. It doesn't say why it's happening or what's doing it. There's actually a link to a nice Twitter thread that explains this in pretty plain language. And in these discourses about saving, it's usually positions somebody as able to save the thing that is endangered, right? And a lot of the time in language endangerment discourse, it is some type of outside person or organization or NGO or project or something that is supposed to come save a language. Sometimes it's even a technology, like, oh, this app is going to save 20 languages, right? So you see this in all kinds of major outlets. And if you read the Jane Hill paper, where she says that talking about these things is actually a form of self-critique because she has used some of these terms in the past, I'm giving this talk with the spirit of self-critique as well, because I have definitely used these terms in my work. Why? We'll talk about audiences in a second, but so this CNN headline, Google fights to save 3,000 dying languages. There were a lot of headlines like this when the Endangered Languages Project launched, and I think most of us who were working on it at the time were like, oh no, why are they saying this? Why are they saying Google is saving languages? And why are they saying that this project is saving languages? That's not how we see this, but it's a very popular way of framing this issue in the news, in the popular media, because it's easy for people to understand. It's what they're used to hearing. So let's talk a little bit more about the words we use and the framing we use to discuss these issues. So you see these death, extinction, dying metaphors all the time, that biological metaphor. What do they imply, aside from languages being alive, being living things? Well, okay, they kind of imply inevitability, right? Anything that's alive is eventually going to die. It's inevitable. They also kind of imply that it's natural for a language to die, because again, if it's a living thing, all living things die. It's normal. It's fine. It's not a crisis. It's just what happens. It's the way the worm turns. And then it also implies permanence, right? We do not yet have resurrection technology. We can't take an extinct animal and bring it back to life. You know, there is no Jurassic Park at this point. And so if we use this biological metaphor and we talk about an extinct language, we're implying that it cannot come back to life. It can't be alive again because it's extinct. So, are these the best terms to use for language? Well, I'm sure y'all have your own thoughts on this. Here are my thoughts, and thoughts that are increasingly shared by a lot of folks in this field. One, languages are not literally biological entities. They're not living things. Languages are social practices done by people. And so they're not doomed to die. You know, they don't have to stop existing because there's a timer on them. They're not alive. And languages are not dead forever if they stop being spoken. A language can be brought back into use if people stop speaking it. Unlike, say, if a species of rhinoceros goes extinct, we don't have a way to make more rhinoceroses alive. Right? Languages are not like that. And another reason is just kind of an issue of kindness or ethical speech. It's just a really harsh way to talk about a painful loss. It is a just a kind of a mean way to put it. And more than that, it's too freaking harsh in painful contexts where language loss is linked to suffering and maybe even death of human beings who used that language. And importantly, we got to think about how the framing of extinction can imply that the people who used a language, the people who were tied to a language, are also extinct. right? Which is generally not true. Even if a language has stopped being spoken, the people who used to use it or their descendants are still here, even if that language is no longer in use among them. So, if we're not going to talk about death and extinction all the time, we got to have some other ways to frame this issue, right? Okay, yes, there are some other alternatives that are currently in use in much of the language world. So, for example, instead of talking about an extinct or dead language, a lot of language workers talk about a dormant or sleeping language. Dormant is essentially another term for sleeping. It's dormant also kind of builds on this biological metaphor a little bit because it's like a seed in the ground in winter, right? You talk about seeds that lie dormant until the spring comes, and then they grow, right? And it correctly implies that a language that is not currently being used, that is silent, can be awakened. It can wake up again and start to be used again. So that more accurately reflects the possibilities for a language that's not being used. You can also say something like silent, or if you want to attribute agency, again, silenced languages, right? Because language loss is something that's done usually by people to other people. But I would love to hear what terms you use, what terms your community uses, what you prefer. I love learning new words and new terminologies. I also want to talk about some common terminology in popular media, like saving languages or rescuing languages or language preservation. These are pretty common words that we see. So there is an implication here that languages, and perhaps by extension, the people who use them, need some kind of savior. Often the entity or person or group positioned as the savior is an outsider in a lot of cases, and that's these narratives of helplessness and victimhood among communities that speak indigenous or endangered languages are really not that accurate and not a very helpful way of framing the issue. The preservation terminology is also, it has its uses, but it always struck me as a little odd because it reminds me of like preserved foods, like pickles. And it also kind of implies that a language can be saved on its own, separate from the people who use it and the contexts where it's used, right? This is something they call extractive language work, where you just kind of pluck a language out of its context and say, okay, I made some recordings, the language is saved. Forget about the people who use the language, don't worry about them, right? And so, what are some reasons maybe these aren't the best ones to use? Well, anyone who's not a user of the language or a member of a community to which that language is tied, they're not really the ones who can save a language, right? No one from the outside can swoop into a language community and be like, I am here to save your language by making 30 hours of recording. No, it's not how it works. It is up to the people who that language belongs to, who that language is tied to keep using it and to bring it back to life and strengthen it. And there's also a really troubling history of dominant cultures killing or severely dispossessing people and cultures, but then preserving artifacts from them in museums and archives, right? You see this over and over with the history of European colonialism across the world. They do their best to eliminate or suppress or disempower people and cultures, but then they sort of take all of the art and the neat historical artifacts and put them in a museum. And artifacts like records of languages, right? You can make great documentation and it's really handy, it's useful, it's good, it's valuable. But having those in an archive is not at all the same thing as sustaining language as used by living people in their daily lives. And I also want to talk about some other rhetorical tactics that we often use in language endangerment. And again, this is a rhetorical tactic I have frequently used for various reasons. So this whole thing about numbers of endangered languages and percentages of endangered languages and number of speakers, this is one of the most common tactics when used in talking to the public or government bodies or funders, whatever, about language endangerment. And sometimes linguists and language advocates do this out of necessity, right? If you are applying for a grant to support your language work, the people giving out that money will almost always ask you for numbers of speakers or the number of records that already exist in that language, and they want to hear these percentages and counts, right? This practice called enumeration is it stems from the tendency among Western bodies of knowledge production and sort of the general public in a lot of Western contexts to consider numbers and statistics as a more valid way of addressing an issue, right? If something is quantified, it must be more true within that framework, right? And that's not the only way of addressing this issue, but it tends to dominate the rhetoric around language endangerment. So you've probably seen things like 46% of all languages are endangered, right? ELP circulates this statistic. It's useful when we're trying to garner support from the public. You might also see constantly repeated the statistic, a language dies every 2 weeks. This probably isn't true. All existing research does not back up that claim, but you see it anyway. Or you'll often see there's only 10 speakers left of this language, sort of as an attention-grabbing headline, right? Why? What's the deal with enumeration? For one, why are we using numbers to talk about a really intensely personal human issue? Like I said, this tends to do with certain societies' belief that numbers and statistics are more valid forms of knowledge. But then if you really address the usefulness of numbers, you have to question whether statistics and counting can actually meaningfully reflect such a complex social reality as language loss and language maintenance. It's a hard thing to quantify. It's a really complicated social issue, and it's hard to shrink that down to statistics and counts, especially because we don't even have a good handle on what it is we're counting. I am not bagging on linguistics as a discipline for this fact, but we still can't even agree as linguists on what counts as a language versus a dialect or a subvariety or whatever. Nobody would probably give you the exact same count of how many languages there are in a given state or country or language family. And then when we get to counting speakers, we have to identify, well, who are we counting as a speaker? Is it somebody who was born and raised speaking the language? Is it someone who learned later in life but is really, really fluent? Is it somebody who just knows a few phrases, right? We have to condense all these incredibly complicated issues into cold, hard numbers, and that is always going to be an imprecise endeavor at best. And so, of course, there are big limits to how useful enumeration can be as an approach to language endangerment and documentation. But I will say this, there may be some usefulness to counting and enumeration for looking at big picture patterns, because there are limits to our ability as human beings to grasp incredibly complex issues. If we were to look at global patterns of language endangerment and maintenance without counting any of it, without quantifying any of it, we might have a hard time wrapping our heads around the scope of it and the pace of it. And so without being able to say something like, well, okay, approximately something like maybe half of the world's languages are endangered, it gives us at least a place to start. It gives us one way to approach mapping out our path forward. And it works best, obviously, if it's used alongside other methods, other ways of thinking and knowing language. But I will personally make a case for enumeration being a little bit useful in some ways. There's also another really popular set of rhetorics you'll see in language endangerment. This is probably the biggest, splashiest, attention-grabbing headline probably see big headlines like last speaker of whatever language dies, or there are two speakers left and the last two speakers won't talk to each other. I think that's a pretty common story that sometimes is true, sometimes is not. And this last speaker concept, or this, God forbid, last peoples concept, is often tied to concepts like vanishing cultures, disappearing peoples, whatever. And in many cases, this is a phrase I really love. It's tied to something that Risalto calls imperialist nostalgia, which can be imagined as when you or your group or your culture destroys something and then engages in mourning for what you have destroyed, right? It's like if I come into your house and I smash your favorite chair, and then I'm like, oh, that is so sad. It was such a beautiful chair. Oh, what a loss, right? You might very reasonably be tempted to say to me, well, you broke it, right? But then I might go write a book about how sad it is that we lost that beautiful chair. Yeah, it's a very heady concept. You'll see this in lots of headlines, from Australia to New York to India. But again, this concept of last speakers can be super problematic because, for one, it's very rarely specified who is being counted as a speaker, right? Maybe the last person who was born and grew up speaking that language has passed away, but their cousin learned it as a kid and speaks it pretty dang well, and they're still alive. There's also the question of who is so sure that there isn't another speaker out there. Because there are documented cases just in the last few decades where the media made a big fanfare about, like, oh, well, this language is now dead because the last speaker passed away. But then a few years later, someone else came forward and said, oh, hey, I didn't hear that my language was allegedly dead. I am still alive and I still speak it, right? So this question of who has the authority to declare someone the last speaker is a very complicated one. And then, just sort of on a personal level, I always wonder why people are so drawn to this narrative of last things, final things. I don't know if it's just 21st century humans being obsessed with apocalyptic thinking. I don't know if it's something that is easy to conceptualize emotionally and intellectually, right? The last anything tends to make people sad. Most of us grew up crying at the movie The Last Unicorn. But I do wonder why this is such a marketable concept when talking about these things. So I've left you a whole lot of references for other papers you can read. So I put the Jenny Davis, Bernard Purley, and Jane Hill papers in the Facebook group, but I don't want to put all these in there because I don't want to get in trouble with all these publishers. So look these up. If you don't have access to them through a university or a library or whatever, you should email me and I will totally not help you find copies, okay? So moving beyond sort of discourses of language endangerment, I want to talk a little bit too about discourses of documentation, which is one of the responses to language endangerment. So obviously language documentation is a big field. The ways we talk about this work and the ideas underlying this work are also really complicated. But I just want to give a little tiny brief overview of some common ideas, especially when it comes to why are endangered languages important and why is documentation important / why do we do language documentation. So if you work in the endangered languages field and you have ever been interviewed by the media like I have, I guarantee somebody has asked you the question, so tell us, why do endangered languages matter? Right? Sometimes we call this the who cares question. And sometimes this question comes with the implication, who cares? Because I don't. Right? You sometimes get people who seem hostile to the cause of language documentation and revitalization asking us to prove somehow that languages matter. And you see this in a lot of headlines, these sort of rhetorical questions, even from national indigenous television, an outlet that one would expect would be on board already. They ran this article called "What is Language Extinction and Why Should We Care?" Right? Usually this is a rhetorical question, but sometimes people ask this quite seriously. Why should I care? And okay, yeah, different people will all have different ways to answer the who cares question. So actually, some scholars have made these typologies of the rhetoric that goes into who cares answers. So Jane Hill and Nick Teberger especially, and Jenny Davis, their papers lay out some categories that I'm going to kind of mush together into one overview here. So for one, there's this common refrain that languages contain some aspect of humanity's shared heritage, right? So you'll often see this in, every language is a page in the book of humanity, or every language is a treasure to all mankind, or something. You see those rhetorics pretty often. Sometimes when you're looking at governmental reports, especially, out of Australia, sometimes out of Canada, Europe, you'll see rhetoric like our languages or our indigenous languages, again, our, coming from a state government of a settler state, you'll see things like, these are priceless national resources. And so you'll see languages being assigned what you might call being evaluated or valorized, and put into a metaphor. There's the biological metaphor, and then there's kind of like the economic metaphor, right? When you call a language a treasure, you're also kind of implying that it's like money, or it's like a resource that can be used and perhaps even bought and sold. And again, most of this rhetoric is well intentioned. It's not purposely trying to turn language into a thing to be bought and sold. It's just the mental frameworks that people respond to. So another reason that we'll often give for why languages matter is that they contain important information and knowledge, right? So linguists will argue that languages contain important information about human cognition and how our brains work and how the language faculty works. You'll often get folks from other disciplines saying that languages contain information about history or social structures or biology or geography, whatever. All this is also true. And of course, you'll get the argument that languages tell us about the history and migration patterns and contact with other human beings going way back into the distant past. And again, that's true, and it's really cool. You can look at language and get good clues as to who people have been in contact with and maybe the ways they traveled in the distant past. I'm going to talk about this ancient wisdom trope a little more in a second, though. And of course, there is the very legitimate argument that language access, language rights, language reclamation, language maintenance are all questions of human rights and social justice and linguistic justice, which absolutely, I think this is probably one of the most valid ways of approaching the why languages matter issue, because languages matter in most cases to the people who use them, full stop, point blank, right? I believe, again, positionality statement, I am a white lady from the dominant society trained as a linguist, but I believe that we shouldn't have to prove that languages matter when, in most cases, they matter so deeply to the people who use them and who want to reclaim them. And this is backed up by organizations with significant international clout and power, like the United Nations, right? So the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples confirms that Indigenous peoples have the right to use and maintain and develop and pass on their languages. So that one's pretty ironclad. I'm not going to pick that one apart, actually. And similarly, languages are really key components of identity and culture for a lot of people. And another aspect of why it matters that I think is really important and perhaps undervalued and under-discussed is that language and access to language and reclamation of language has a pretty direct tie in a lot of cases to the well-being of actual people, right? Their mental health, their physical health, the robustness of their communities and social relations. Having access to one's own language makes human beings' lives better in a lot of cases, and it's hard to argue with the usefulness and benefit of that. But I want to pick apart this universal ownership and valorization thread for a minute, right? Because we see this all the time, things like humanity's heritage and the priceless treasures of indigenous languages, whatever. And I want to ask y'all to think critically about whether all languages do actually belong to all people, right? When you see things like the loss of any language is an impoverishment of the human sum of knowledge, this kind of implies that, you know, let's say the last speaker of Great Andamanese passed away a few years ago, and this implies that the loss of that language in the world of spoken languages today hurts people like me on the other side of the world somehow, or a student in the Philippines is hurt by that loss, or a car dealer in Ecuador. Is it true? Maybe in some sense, in a metaphorical sense, perhaps in a literal sense, but it does not foreground the people who really feel that loss most keenly, which is other members of the Andamanese community, right? And so it sort of obscures the loss that is most direct to the people involved, the stakeholders of that language, and zooms it way out and puts the focus on this hazy global population. Um, and this term of impoverishment as well, right? This ties back into the valuation metaphor, or what Jane Hill calls hyperbolic valorization, where we see languages as some type of natural or national resource that can be used or traded or something, right, that belongs to everybody. Um, and I'm not saying that it's wrong to use this metaphor. I'm just saying that we should think very carefully, as Jane Hill says, about who's listening, what audiences are listening when we use these metaphors, and how they will interpret them, right? If I tell someone, I'm going to, let's just say, someone whose grandmother is one of the last speakers of Uchinaguchi. And I'm like, oh man, when your grandma passes away and we lose one of the last speakers, really all of humanity is going to be impoverished. That person would be forgiven for saying, like, that's a really rude and crappy thing to say because this is my grandmother, this is my heritage language, right? The loss is keenest to me and my family. I don't really care how it affects the rest of humanity. That is a distant concern at best, right? So I just want y'all to chew on these concepts and think about other ways perhaps to frame this issue and to frame why language matters. And now we are going really long, but repositories of knowledge concept. Like, yeah, it's really important that certain languages might contain words for how two plants grow together or the name of a species that other people don't know about. That is really important and it's cool and it's awesome. But we need to think critically about who that knowledge belongs to, right? It is great that the Seri language contains knowledge about farming seaweed for grains, but does that knowledge belong to me, who has never learned about farming seaweed? I don't think so. I think it belongs to Seri seaweed farmers, because there is a long and terrible tradition of extractive research, especially in Western academia, where some scholar will show up in a community, learn some piece of important information, and just kind of take off with it and never give due credit or compensation to the people who shared that knowledge. Especially like there's a famous case of biopharmaceutical companies learning about medicinal plants from people in the Amazon and just kind of bouncing and going and making millions of dollars off that medicinal knowledge and never giving credit or compensation to the people who really hold that knowledge. So we want to be really careful about that and be careful that the ways we talk about language endangerment and documentation don't encourage that kind of extractive research. And also, I just want to share a little pet peeve about this whole ancient languages or old languages trope. I see this a lot in every country's media about language endangerment and language documentation. You'll often see like, oh, the wisdom held in one of the world's most ancient languages. Like, especially Native American languages tend to be called ancient languages very often in American media, but this is also in every country. uh, yes, it's true that a lot of cultures and languages have spent a long time developing in one place and have really long established ties to that land, to other people around them. I'm not arguing that at all. But this idea that some languages are ancient and some languages are new, first, it's kind of artificial, right? All languages are constantly changing. And, Hindi 5,000 years, well, okay, Hindi didn't exist 5,000 years ago. Hindi 200 years ago was probably different in its spoken form. The way English 200 years ago in the US was different in its spoken form. The way Zulu 200 years ago was different. And so we don't want to artificially designate some languages as ancient and some as modern because all languages are always changing. All languages are in some sense new, and all languages are in some sense old. But more than that, more importantly, the ancient trope often goes hand in hand with the primitive trope. And I see this especially US and European and Australian news outlets have luckily mostly quit using this primitive trope for the most part. But I see this in media from other countries a lot that, this tribe is primitive, or this primitive language is being developed, or whatever. And I could talk about this concept for a long time. I won't because we have other things to do. But this binary between contemporary languages and cultures and primitive or ancient or old languages and cultures, A, it's really artificial, and B, it's often used as justification to suppress or remove agency from or disempower or dispossess specific communities and cultures, right? If you say that some language or some culture is primitive, it's a very short step to saying, and it is now the responsibility of our modern dominant culture to develop them, right? And this can go really bad places, and it often does go really bad places. This leads to dispossession and residential schools and sometimes genocide, and it's not a path that is good to go down. There's a book that approaches this ancientness concept in anthropology called Time and the Other. It's a quick read and it's interesting. I would recommend it if you don't mind reading anthropological works. Anyway, that's just a pet peeve off my chest. I would love to hear your thoughts on the ancientness trope. And a little bit more on documentation itself. So, the briefest history in the world of language documentation, just one slide. So, the concept of writing down languages is a super old concept. For millennia, people have been traveling other places or going to war with other people and writing down their languages. Maybe they want to trade and they need to know the word for salt, whatever. So that's not a new concept, but it was generally not super structured. It was not with the explicit goal of making a record of that language. It was usually like, oh, hey, other people who travel here after me, here's how you say, I need a horse, right? And then another purpose of language documentation cropped up later, probably in the last millennium or so, and became much more prevalent after sort of the colonial expansion project moved into the Western Hemisphere. Missionary linguistics is a huge backdrop of language documentation, right? Always with the purpose of producing Bibles and converting people to Christianity for the most part. And missionary linguistics is still actually a really, really big presence in contemporary language documentation. So you got SIL, the Summer Institute of Linguistics / Société Internationale de Linguistique, and they are in the tradition of mission linguistics, but also now kind of hybridizing with what you might call documentary linguistics. But modern language documentation, in sort of the academic sense, has its roots in linguistic anthropology, which kind of this modern language documentation took off in some pretty gross contexts. There was a lot of this lasting discourse around early linguistic anthropology and documentation. Sort of, we'll talk about that in a second. But when we talk about language documentation of the sort that I'm trained in, that we're talking about in this webinar, that really took off about 30 years ago, around 1992, with an article in Language, the biggest linguistics journal, by Michael Krauss about the concept of language endangerment and about the loss of many of the world's languages. And ironically, that article is probably where that a language dies every 2 weeks statistic was born. A 30-year-old article from a time when we didn't have very good data on language endangerment. So it's time to put that 30-year-old concept to bed. Let it be dormant for a while. But you can read some of these articles and check out some relevant books in the links on this slide. Anyway, so the ideologies that underlie language documentation in the past and today, right? Language documentation is done for a purpose, no matter when you're doing it or who you are or where you're working. There's a reason you're doing language documentation. So in the past, there was a lot of what linguists sometimes call butterfly collecting, right? Just gathering stuff because it's interesting and it's a curiosity and you can put it in a book and all your linguist friends will go, oh, that's cool, how interesting, right? Just sort of a hobbyist's interest or at best an academic interest, right? And like I said, the context of that early 20th century linguistic anthropology, there was a big popular the wild and gross cultural moment around that type of work. And so, yeah, those concepts still do arise in contemporary language documentation. There are linguists who do this work for those reasons. I will refrain from comment on those as motivations for contemporary language documentation. But today, I'd say most people working in language documentation have one or more of the following ideologies that underlie their work, right? So for me personally, I became interested in the idea of language documentation because I was interested in the idea of posterity, in the idea of what will our descendants many hundreds of years from now know about Earth as it is today? What will they remember? How do we transmit information into the future, right? Those kind of big philosophical questions were very interesting to me. And I thought of language documentation as tying into passing information into the future, passing knowledge into the future, telling our descendants about how Earth was when we were alive, right? And again, this is not unrelated to this artifacts in museums concept. It shares a lot of ideological underpinnings. I will totally cop to that. Um, so there's common threads still there. But there's also today a lot of documentation for research purposes, which is not, again, totally unlike this butterfly collecting, doing it because it's interesting thing. But, there's also research into how our brains work that is done for the purpose of assisting people to have better lives. And I'm not slamming academic research for the sake of advancing science or human knowledge on its own. That's legit too. But there's also still a lot of, like I said, missionary linguistics documentation to gain access to a speaker population. So not only for Bible translation and proselytization, but also governments will engage in language documentation so that they can know what the people are speaking in a village under their control, right? Or, if they need to listen in on your phone call, they don't want you to be able to be a code talker and talk in a language they don't understand, perhaps. I think that's probably one of the less common reasons to do language documentation, though. And finally, I think perhaps, in my opinion, one of the best and most useful reasons that people do documentation is as a safety net for their own language communities or for a language community they're hoping to support, right? Having good records of a language is not only useful to people who just kind of want to learn the language in the future, but as a safety net for revitalization. It is very difficult to do language revitalization if you don't have living speakers or signers. But if you have a really robust body of language documentation, it's still possible. And so having good documentation can feel like a safety net to a lot of folks who are engaged in revitalization of a language where time is not on their side, where there is a small number of elder speakers maybe, and there's a comfort in knowing that there is documentation to fall back on if, God forbid, all of the speakers pass away. Obviously, there are many other reasons to engage in language documentation, and I want to hear from you about them. And finally, one last thing. I know we're going long. Stick with me, please. One last thing I want to touch on is some ideologies about what we document. And so the why is one thing, the what is another thing. So in the past, and even today, it's really common to document one language, right? You're going to have a documentation project focused on XYZ language. Usually we think of that language in kind of an essentialist way. So it's tied to one community or group, right? So I'm going to document the Iyasa language used by Iyasa people. And sometimes that works. Sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes it really doesn't. It's also common to document what linguists call, big word, the lexicogrammatical code, essentially the words and grammar of a language, without as much focus on how it's used in social contexts or sort of how it helps people relate to each other. And then finally, it has been really common for documentation to focus on what you might call the ancestral code, the version of a language that's conceived of as being the oldest or most pure or most authentic or traditional or whatever, right? I didn't put a link in. I wrote a paper on this in Iyasa, sort of the concept of what is the purest and realist language and says who, and right? But generally, this is the variety used by monolingual rural elders, if such people exist. So, a documentary linguist might be like, well, if I want to get the real language, I got to go talk to an old guy out in the village who doesn't speak any other languages. And you might call this linguistic purism, right? Looking for perhaps the fictional concept of the most pure language. Of course, there are varieties of language that you might want to focus on for your documentation work for totally legitimate reasons. I guess I'm speaking mostly sort of from the academic perspective here. I don't think there's one variety of language that's better or more pure or more worth documenting than others. But traditionally, you might take this monolingual elder lady who only speaks Kui and be like, yeah, she's the real deal. She speaks the real language. And then take a younger urban woman who speaks Kui but also speaks English and Hindi and be like, well, her language is, it's all mixed up and messy and I don't want to document that. But today, and hopefully going forward a little more, at least from my perspective as a sociolinguistically oriented documentation person, I think it's good for us to go beyond the ancestral code and beyond just looking at one language maybe, right? Because multilingualism is actually the norm in most parts of the world. There are not that many monolingual communities on this earth, aside from America. Poor us. Poor us. So I think it's great to consider also documenting multilingualism, other languages used by people in the community, the ways they mix those languages together in speech, different varieties of the language, maybe those used by young people or older people or men or women or whatever, and language practices that I haven't even thought of yet because they don't work the way that my Western language ideologies expects them to work, right? And I'm giving a shout out to the late Tucker Childs, one of my mentors who passed away last week. And a big part of his work was striving to overcome the way in which Western language ideologies have unjustly influenced language documentation practices in non-Western societies, as his obituary from the Linguistic Society of America noted. It's really important for us to think critically about the limitations of our own language ideologies and the ways we think about language and strive to expand how we do language documentation to better match the communities and societies in which we work. Yeah, we want to try to expand our documentation practices to those framed in indigenous worldviews and non-Western worldviews. I'm not the person to do that because I have a lot of extremely Western worldviews, but I want to hear from y'all about other ways you might frame your documentation work. All right. Whew. Okay, I'm like 5 minutes past when we were supposed to have stopped already, but I want to talk to y'all. I want to hear questions. I want to discuss. You can always email me or post in the group if we don't have time to get to your question now, but let's do this. Let's talk. I'm going to scroll back up to look at all your questions. Okay. And some things for y'all to talk about amongst yourselves. Just think about on your own. Why do you want to do documentation? What is the goal? What are the ideologies underlying your work? How are your perspectives different than mine or from academia's? And what other themes do you see in how people talk about endangered languages and language documentation? And what do you think about those themes? All right, so Heather says, I know some people who believe language is spirit, death, and extinction has a materialistic ring to it. Yes, yes, this is a really fabulous point. So the biological metaphor of language, again, is materialistic, not in the sense of like wanting money, but in the materialist sense of everything that is real is physical and you can touch it and see it, as opposed to spiritual or intangible, right? And for a lot of folks, yes, language is a spiritual entity. It is alive in the spiritual sense, but not the biological sense. And so something that is a spiritual entity can't really be dead or extinct in the same way as an animal or a plant or a person. And so, yeah, language death is a really materialist way to frame it. Thank you, Heather. That is a beautiful point. Also, I see, yes, Heather, you said preservation makes you think of languages as pickles. I see we're on the same wavelength there. Very good. And Lisa, yeah, notes that extinction and death is too final and that wording discourages language revitalization. I very much agree. It's like there's one of the articles I linked here by Wes Leonard is sort of like, well, if he's working in the revival of the Miamia language, and he quotes a youth who says, well, if Miama is a dead language, how are we speaking it, right? It's discouraging and it's also inaccurate. Let's see. Ivana says language versus dialect, a daily question. Yeah, whew, that's a rough one. You know, if you go to linguistics conferences and linguists have a little too much to drink, don't ask them about languages versus dialects because they might start fist fights. Let's see. Oh yeah, so Maurice says, I'm not sure the ones destroying languages are the same ones being sad about its loss. And Shirley responded, I think Anna's point about this imperialist nostalgia was she was talking specifically about the destroyers being sad. Yeah, this is a complicated question because then we get into responsibility and agency in broader systems that perpetuate language loss, right? Like, me personally, am I going out and silencing languages? No. In fact, I am actively working every day of my life to reverse that. However, as a member of white capitalist America, I am in some ways perpetuating the systems that cause language loss. That's a really complicated one. It's a really complicated one. And I think the notion of imperialist nostalgia is unpacked much better in that paper I linked to on that slide. I won't speak for Risaldo on that. Let's see. Fishman's response gives us the creativity for critical thinking. I'm trying to remember which paper that is. Joshua Fishman was a sociolinguist who worked a lot in the field of what he called reversing language shift, especially from his perspective with his own language, Yiddish. He looked a lot at the factors that allow people to push back against those forces of language loss and maintain their languages. And I agree, it takes a lot of creativity and critical thinking and endurance to resist language loss. And I think Jenny Davis's paper does a really great job talking about that, talking about reframing these issues, and not in terms of why are so many languages dying, but how are so many languages still vital? How are so many languages being reclaimed and maintained? Because if we start asking those questions, we'll start getting more creative and perhaps more useful answers. Let's see. Gerardo asks, how can we define a speaker and how many words or phrases determine whether a person speaks a language? Oh, Right, right. That's the question. And I think this notion of speaker is often not really theorized and not really explained in a lot of work on this topic. People just kind of say, okay, there are 20 speakers. And then you, as the reader, might go, well, what kind of speakers? Are they fully fluent speakers? Are they semi speakers? What do those terms even mean? So, that is a great question. And I would encourage anybody doing work in this field to unpack what you mean by speaker when you use the word speaker or signer if you're dealing with sign languages. Make it a bit clearer what exactly you mean when you talk about speakers. Um, and Heather also notes, yes, we need more ways to describe other people with relationships to the language who are not actually speakers. Yes, Heather, bingo. We have some limited terms like heritage learner or language community member or language stakeholder, but again, these are kind of imprecise terms, and we could really use more concrete terms to talk about this stuff. Um, yes, Heather says she doesn't like heritage very much to describe languages because it sounds as if the language's place is in the past. Yeah, I can totally see that. It's tough to talk about one's relationship to one's ancestry and one's ancestors without using that word heritage, but I'm sure there are better ways. Maybe ancestral language, but that goes into the ancestral code. Man, this is the problem with thinking hard about the way you talk, right? You start second guessing everything you say and wondering, like, isn't there a better way for me to say this? Yeah, we'll all have to work together to come up with some more useful ways to phrase these things. Um, let's see. Sean, weighing in on the speaker question, says, I've seen anywhere from can speak a few words to ability to carry out a conversation in all domains of use. And this isn't only limited to endangered languages, but it's debated in second language learning, etc. Yeah, this is a question that plagues basically every language-related discipline. Yeah. Um, Subeka says the ancient trope may also go hand in hand with first or most resistant or most conservative or more authentic. And it all goes back to how the native speakers perceive and analyze those tropes. Yes, absolutely. All of these concepts and tropes really have to be looked at in the context of how the users of that language see them, right? That was actually a research paper I wrote on this concept of being a speaker of IASA. I basically did interviews with a whole bunch of people trying to understand what it means to an IASA person to count as a good speaker of the language. And unsurprisingly, the answer varied a lot across people, right? Like old people thought young people really weren't good speakers. Young people thought they were perfectly good speakers. A lot of men thought that men were better speakers than women, and plenty of women were like, oh yeah, women are great speakers, right? So not only do you have to ask the people who are stakeholders of that language, but you have to expect a lot of variation among those people. Yeah, it's so complicated and fascinating, and I love languages. Yes. Zach says the use of how history is written and rewritten through time is really interesting. It's used in so many different areas to promote otherness. Yeah. Yeah, what's that proverb I just saw the other day that I think it's an Achebe thing he said that was like, if the history of the hunt were written by lions, it would be very different. Something like that. Yeah. Um, Shirley notes that on the idea of transmitting knowledge into the future, the Long Now Foundation has some pretty cool projects. Yes, it does. Yeah, the Long Now Foundation is an interesting project that aims to engage with the concept of long-term human survival and posterity. So one of the things they did was they built a clock that's supposed to run on its own energy for 10,000 years out in the middle of the desert, so that some people or aliens or intelligent dolphins or something in 10,000 years might find a functional clock showing that humans 10,000 years ago were thinking about the far future. But they've also got a project called the Rosetta Disk, and it is a laser engraved disc of, I believe, metal that has words from like 4,000 languages on it. And I think they sent a copy into space. so that either spacefaring entities in the future or humans in the future could find a record of Earth's linguistic diversity. Yeah, this posterity concept can also get kind of grim because it forces you to grapple with who will be alive by then and what they will be like, and that can be heady stuff. But I'll go back to language. Um, let's see. One thing missing in this slide is ethnobotany documentation. Yep, it's often funded by pharmaceutical companies searching for the next great medicine. Yes, exactly, because there is a whole lot of traditional knowledge and especially medical and pharmaceutical knowledge that is known and has been passed down by indigenous communities that outside or Western science is not aware of, and that has really huge potential to save lives and prevent human suffering. But of course, the goal of pharmaceutical companies is usually not to do this research for charitable purposes or humanistic purposes. It's to make a lot of money. And so, yeah, that's where we get into extractive ethnobotanical research as well. Everybody's hoping to make a profit off of stealing indigenous people's knowledge in a lot of cases. Gerardo asks on community-driven language documentation. Yeah, yes. I hoped to sort of include the range of perspectives on who does language documentation, right? It's not always, and in fact often is not, someone coming in from the outside to do documentation. I think much of the best language documentation is done by people from within that cultural context, from within that linguistic context, because they have understanding of the language and its social uses that outsiders really can't get over a few years or even decades, right? Living with a language, growing up, or spending a great deal of your life in the context of that language gives you insight that's hard to duplicate. Um, Oh, Sean mentions that broad spectrum antiviral against various influenzas and coronaviruses was just found from a plant in Greece and Italy. That's cool. I hope that that knowledge is used for the benefit of all people, even those who can't pay money for it. Heather, the ways people play with language, the way people make up new words, the way people, yeah, get creative with language. One of the things I love most about working in African linguistics is there is a lot of study being done and a lot of attention being paid now to what some people call youth languages or urban youth languages, which are sort of these really creative, fast-changing blends and hybridizations of other languages that are used to mark coolness and youth identity and all kinds of other things. So maybe you've heard of Sheng, which is like a Swahili English hybrid language spoken in Nairobi. Although the research on that is like 20 years old now, so maybe it's uncool and the youth don't use it anymore. But these creative hybrid languages pop up all over the place, especially in urban African contexts, but also elsewhere. And the research on that is really exciting and really joyful to see all of the ways that humans can get creative with language. Let's see. Subeka says, even in America, there are more bilingual than monolinguals, I assume. People can speak more than one English, regional, and social variety. Yeah, that's true. That is totally true. And I guess it depends, again, on where we want to draw that line between language and dialect, right? Like, I can do what they call style shifting between, informal English and rigid academic English and Southern English and whatever. I don't know if I'd call that multilingualism, but you could. There's a case to be made for sure. People in America can nowadays include AAVE, that's African American English, for those of you who don't know that acronym, and Midwest English in their resumes as two separate varieties. Yeah, I agree. I think it's useful for people to acknowledge and present as valid and helpful all of the different varieties they can speak. Yeah. Um, Subeka also hopes that we make it a ritual to give this presentation. Yeah, we're going to have webinars every week, so I hope you can join us. Heather notes, I wish multilingualism or polylingualism was considered important at a time there were more polylingual elders in gathering to visit. Yes, I agree. I think that's one of the really important things for us to think about and document and look at is the roles that multilingualism can play in a society or in a community, because obviously there are times when using one specific language would be socially appropriate, but there are also times when that kind of multilingual fluidity or hybridity or however you want to put it is more appropriate socially, right? There have been times personally, anecdotally, in Cameroon when everyone around me was speaking like Cam Franglais, which is kind of like a hybrid of English and Pidgin English and French. And I was speaking just kind of like plain monolingual French. And I think it made me come off as kind of stuck up or nerdy or something, right? Because I couldn't do that multilingual hybridity language play, and it wasn't cool, right? Um, let's see, could I speak to emic versus etic perspectives when documenting a language? Yeah, so anyone who has done a little bit of reading in linguistic anthropology or sociolinguistics, you may have come across this distinction of emic versus etic or emic or however you want to pronounce it. This is how do I simplify this? Basically, the differences between approaching something from the inside and approaching something from the outside, roughly put. And so if I am looking at, I don't know, talk among American nerds about science fiction, I can come at that from an emic perspective because I'm an American nerd who likes science fiction. I'm coming from within that speech community or community of practice, versus if like my buddy from New Delhi came and tried to document that, he might be coming at it from an etic perspective because that's not his cultural context. Um, I feel like that's a much longer answer than I can give right now, though. Sorry, Subeka. We can talk about it more in the group. That's a huge area of research. Cecilia, I'm sorry I don't speak Spanish. I'm going to try and guess what your comment is. Documenting languages also is for understanding part of social and biocultural problems. I hope I translated that right. Yeah, I agree, absolutely, because like we covered last semester, language endangerment doesn't happen generally because everything is fine in a community. You know, language loss often accompanies other forms of suffering or trauma, or at least big change, right? Change isn't always bad. Changing languages isn't always bad, but it often is a symptom or I don't want to say like a comorbidity, but it often goes along with other troubles that people are facing. And so, yeah, language documentation can often give us insights into the troubles or at least the changes that people are currently going through. Alistair says it'd be good if you can link to non-Western ways of ideologies of language endangerment and documentation. Yeah, absolutely. I linked to in the earlier slide. So yeah, Jenny Davis, Wes Leonard, and Bernard Purley are all Indigenous authors working on this topic. I will also add some more references you can consult in the group. Actually, yeah, and Jeff Good and Pierpaolo De Carlo have done a lot of really cool work on language ideologies in the lower Fungom region of Cameroon. You should check that out too. And Friedrich Lupke has done some neat stuff about language ideologies in sort of like the Senegalese Casamance context as well. Let's see, Anne says, one of the reasons is basically to document differences in terms which could help mother tongue-based educators so that they could present different regional languages, as we have several in our city. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important, especially when you're doing language documentation, to support languages in education, to recognize and honor all the different ways that your students might speak, right? It's one thing to say, we're going to bring Zulu into the classroom, and it's another thing to say, okay, we're going to acknowledge that the students in this classroom might speak different kinds of Zulu, they might have different vocabulary, they might use different idioms. So the more knowledge and the more depth you have to your documentation, the better you can support the use of that language in education. Absolutely. Oh, and Shirley put a link to the 10,000 Year Clock project. Thank you, Shirley, and the Rosetta Project. Let's see. The word restitution is not often used, and I don't understand why or what it is that people don't like about it. Like language restitution. I actually have not encountered that word in the language endangerment world. I'm trying to think really how it would be applied because I think of restitution as largely monetary. That's kind of the implication it has in my mind is you get financial restitution from a court case or something. And I guess linguistic restitution might be something like linguistic reparations, something along those lines, which I guess is a little bit like, the US government giving money for language revitalization among indigenous communities in the US as like a acknowledgement that they were directly responsible for a lot of the language loss in the US. I guess that could be an example of linguistic restitution. I would love to hear you elaborate on that if you have any more thoughts on that. Yeah, Nathan says, is that similar to repayment? Yeah, that's the context it has for me too. Let's see, Sean mentions for those interested in dialect versus language. Yes, William O'Grady and Se-Jung Yang have done a lot of this for a language called Jejuo, which previously was considered a dialect of Korean, but is actually a separate language. This is one of those cases where the language dialect boundary is often determined by social and political factors instead of linguistic ones. And so, yeah, they have some great sort of diagnostic tools you can use to try and figure out if something could be called a language instead of a dialect. Linguists tend to try to use one criterion to determine language versus dialect, and that is what we call mutual intelligibility. So basically, can people speaking these varieties understand each other or not? And how much can they understand? And so, yeah, if you're interested in doing those types of assessments, I can put you in touch with some resources to help you sort of get a sense of how intelligible two languages are. Let's see. Dr. Siraj says, can I join your EL project? How? I'm a research scholar in tribal languages. Yeah. Well, yes, I guess it depends on what you mean by join. Yes, you are always welcome to contribute information, knowledge sharing, resources about those languages. We also have a volunteer program that I'm trying to get off the ground right now. I'll paste a link to our volunteer sign up form in the chat in just a second. Let's see. Yeah, oh, and Nathan brings up the concept of cultural reparations and reparations of physical objects. That could be, yeah, I guess that could be something we could call language restitution. So the repatriation of, let's say, language recordings that are held in archives. So, taking copies of them or the originals of them and giving them back to the descendants of the people who made those recordings or of the relevant tribe or nation whose language that is. I guess we could call that language restitution in a sense. But yes, like Nathan says, this is kind of specific to the U.S., the use of that term in that context. I don't know if there's a similar use of the term repatriation or restitution in other countries. Please weigh in if you know. Let's see. I think I have reached the end of y'all's questions, perhaps. So I'll give it a minute and see if anyone else has any other questions. But in the meantime, I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight and giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts and explore some concepts around this topic. I'm really excited and honored to have been able to do this. I've been interested in this concept of looking more critically at the way we talk and think about these things since I started in linguistics. So it's kind of a dream come true to be able to give a presentation about this for y'all. Thank you for coming and listening and sharing your thoughts. And I hope that if you have anything else you want to talk about or share or questions to ask or anything else, post them in the Facebook group. You don't have to only come to the Facebook group when it's time for a live session. You are always welcome to hang out there and chat and post. Yeah. Let's see. Heather says, yes, let's find a way to compel linguists and others to give back language documentation to the respective communities. Yes, 100%. Absolutely. I think any linguist attempting to do this work ethically should have a plan in place for leaving copies of their work with the relevant community right away. They should also probably do their best to engage the community on the overall scope and topics of the language documentation to the best of their ability. I tried to do this in my own work, but you often meet challenges when folks in a given community are not familiar with the concept of language documentation or archival, or they're just kind of like, I don't care, that's not interesting to me. Uh, and I hope that as more people try and do this kind of work, we will find more successful ways to build those collaborative community relationships and relationships of mutual benefit in language documentation. Yeah. Um, uh, let's see. Heather says we need a college of linguists or similar to go to. Yeah, yeah, heck yeah. We need a list of like linguists who are cool about language work and won't be jerks and keep all your data for themselves. Like a board of ethical language documenters of some kind. I think there was a paper by Jeff Good and Lise Dobrin like a decade ago about it was about the Summer Institute of Linguistics, but they sort of said, why don't we have an international body of linguists who are doing sort of language documentation and development and revitalization work pro bono? Why don't, and I think they proposed having like a Linguists Without Borders, the way we have Doctors Without Borders. And ever since I read that paper like 10 years ago, that was my dream. Like, yes, let's start Linguists Without Borders, people who will do this work ethically and for free for language communities who want them to. So anybody who wants to help me start Linguists Without Borders, send me an email. Let's see. Nathan also notes, yes, Natives for Linguistics is an ongoing project pushing the Linguistic Society of America to address these issues. Yes, exactly. Check them out. You can just Google Natives number 4 Linguistics. It's basically a working group of Indigenous scholars in the US and maybe also Canada. I don't know LSA's scope. But yeah, it's Native linguists who are working within the Linguistic Society of America to better represent Native interests and perspectives and sort of academic goals and frameworks within contemporary linguistics. And Jennifer mentions Colang. Yeah, Colang is another awesome resource for anybody interested in this kind of work. It's short for the Institute on Collaborative Language Research. It's held every 2 years, I believe, during the summer. And it's basically like a summer school that linguists and community language workers and anybody else who wants to do this kind of work can go and learn from both sort of like academic linguists and community linguists and people who are both about ethical, useful, practical ways to do this type of language documentation and revitalization. So yeah, Colang, love it. Sean notes that there is Translators Without Borders. Yes, there is. They've been doing some great work translating COVID information. That's awesome. Yeah, so it sounds like lots of people have the dream of joining Linguists Without Borders. So could someone please find a billionaire to fund us and we'll get this started? Because I guess even if we're doing all this work for free, we have to buy food and pay rent. So somebody find us some funding, please. All right. I'm keeping an eye out for any final questions or comments, but I want to thank everybody for staying like 30 minutes past our scheduled time. I guess it's Friday night and most of us are in lockdown, so we got nothing better to do. Yes, Colang 2022 will be held at the University of Montana. Oh, and yes, Jennifer, thank you for the shout out and the reminder. Everyone should register for in March. It's held every 2 years at I think it's my favorite conference in linguistics and language work. It's great. It's a really nice mixture of folks who are working within university structures, folks who are working at the community level, people who are working in nonprofits or NGOs. And so it brings together people from a lot of perspectives and backgrounds to share the work they are doing in language documentation and revitalization. And it's just great vibes. Everyone has such interesting things to share. and you learn so much about languages all over the world, and you meet so many great people. And this year, it's all online, and so it's super cheap to register, and you don't have to go to Hawaii. So just Google ICLDC7 and you'll find it. It's like $5 for students and people in developing countries. It's really cheap. Oh, Shirley put a link already. Thank you. It's great. It's a great conference. Yeah. Check it out. Lots of good, almost free learning this year. And I will plug my talk that I'm giving about ELP and our upcoming revitalization help desk. And yes, Heather and I first met at ICLDC. She gave me some super good feedback on my talk. So go to ICLDC. You will meet cool people who will give you good feedback, and then you'll become friends. Hooray! Yeah, usually I'd say go to ICLDC because you get to go to Honolulu in February or March, and that's usually really easy to convince people to go to Hawaii in the winter. But this year you'll just have to do it on the internet. It's still worth it though. All right, is that it? Are we all done talking about these things? Maybe. Okay. Well, if there's anything that is still on your mind that you did not ask, put it in the group. We'll always be there to talk about it. And next week, we will have a presentation on language digitization and sort of advanced techniques in getting your language onto the internet and for use in computers. And if you have or Facebook in your language, Craig Cornelius, who is both from Google and the Unicode Consortium, will be talking about ways to bring your language online and get it sort of into the computational world, as well as how you can maintain control over your language data and ensure data sovereignty as you digitize your language. So Craig has helped develop Gmail interfaces for Cherokee and Fulfulde languages and lots of other languages with unique scripts all over the world. So he is very seasoned in working with language communities to get their languages working correctly on computers and looking good in their fonts. So tune in next week. It should be super interesting. Next week, yes, it will be Craig. Heather, you know him. Um, let's see. Yeah, so next week we will be 1 hour later, I think, 1 hour later than this. So I will post the little graphic like usual with the time and the date and everything. So next week, usually it will be at 3 p.m. Hawaii. Next week it will be at 4 p.m. Hawaii because Craig has a job and he has to do this talk after his job. Yes. So we will see you next week. It should be fun, and I hope to see you all there. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us this week, and I hope everyone has a safe and fun